The September night in Cadone was shrouded in mist, and the chill was already beginning to be felt in the air. The quiet town, surrounded by forests and lakes, was sinking into peace, but that evening it witnessed a tragedy that shook it to its core. A 911 call shattered the silence. On the other end of the line was Thomas Clayton, his voice trembling with agitation like an autumn wind. "My wife, she's dead. I just found her, in the bedroom." His words spilled out in a chaotic stream, each sound filled with horror and despair. The emergency operator tried to remain calm, asking questions to gather as much information as possible. Thomas, still trembling and nearly in tears, answered the questions, trying to follow the instructions as he awaited the arrival of the police. Meanwhile, the night in Cadone continued to flow, and the town was plunging into darkness, unaware that events were about to unfold that would forever change it. The streets were empty, and only the sound of police cars disrupted the silence. Patrol cars drove through the narrow streets, lighting the way with the bright flash of their sirens. Soon, the entire task force had gathered in front of the Clayton house. The September night had already descended into deep darkness by the time detectives Jack Rivers and Lisa Holt arrived at the crime scene in Cadone. On their way to the Clayton house, their cars carved a path through the dense forest, and soon the dark outlines of the house appeared among the trees. At the doorstep of the Clayton house, they were met by a police officer who had been the first on the scene. He reported that the firefighters had already dealt with a small fire caused by a lamp explosion, but the house still bore the marks of fear and destruction. Lisa and Jack exchanged quick glances, took a deep breath, and entered the house. Inside, the silence was indescribable, almost palpable, like a thick fog. The bedroom door was ajar, and just beyond it lay a scene that shocked the detectives. They were confronted with a room in disarray. Broken furniture, overturned items, and blood on the floor. The smell of blood and decay permeated every corner, oppressive and revolting. Lisa Holt scanned the room, noting every detail. Her eyes focused on Kelly Clayton's body lying on the floor. Her gaze was intent, and each movement was precise and careful. She noticed that Kelly was positioned in a way that suggested a struggle. Her body was disheveled, as if she had tried to escape something terrifying. Blood pooled around her, forming stains that spoke of violence. Jack Rivers concentrated on the details. His experience allowed him to see that despite the signs of a struggle, the doors had not been forced open, and the windows remained intact. This indicated that the killer likely knew how to enter the house and possibly had personal motives. Firefighters and a few police officers were still in the room. As detectives, Jack and Lisa immediately set to work. Lisa documented the crime scene, taking notes and photographs, while Jack began to search the room for evidence. In another part of the house, in the living room, Thomas Clayton sat with his head in his hands. His face was gaunt, his eyes red from tears and exhaustion. Officers had asked him to calm down, but his state clearly indicated severe shock. Lisa and Jack knew they needed to establish a timeline of events to piece together the details of what had happened. "Jack Rivers, Thomas, let's start with you telling us what happened. Try to remember everything you can." Thomas lifted his head, his gaze empty, but he began to recount how, after a poker night with friends, he returned home to find Kelly dead. His words were uncertain and trailed off mid-sentence. The detectives listened intently to every word, trying to catch any inconsistencies or details that might shed light on what had happened. Lisa took notes of his statements while Jack continued to inspect the house, paying close attention to every detail that might prove useful in the investigation. By the time the detectives finished examining the house, it was late, and the night had cast its shadow over Cadone. Silence returned to the house, but it was filled with fear and uncertainty. The investigation had only just begun, and there was much work ahead to reconstruct the events of that fateful night. The interrogation room was dimly lit by a single lamp, creating an atmosphere of tension. Thomas Clayton sat at the table, tapping his fingers on the wooden surface, his gaze fixed downward. Detectives Jack Rivers and Lisa Holt sat across from him, ready to begin the next phase of their investigation. "Let's go over the events of that night once more, Thomas," Jack began, opening his notebook. "We've heard your version, but we need to make sure we haven't missed anything." Thomas nodded, trying to appear confident despite the visible signs of stress. He began recounting how he spent the evening with friends playing poker, drinking, and socializing. His voice was monotonous, as if he had repeated the same words over and over again. We played late into the night, he said. At some point, I looked at the clock and realized it was time to go home. I said goodbye to the guys and left. When I got back, the house was in complete disarray. I saw Kelly. I just couldn't believe it. I called 911 as soon as I saw her. Jack and Lisa listened intently, noting down every detail. Lisa, arms crossed, asked a clarifying question. You say that after you found the body, you called the police right away. But tell us, how did you open the door? Did you notice anything unusual? Thomas hesitated, seeming to stumble over the question. He appeared slightly flustered, but then responded. No, I didn't notice anything strange. The door was open, just as I had left it. But when I went inside, everything was turned upside down. Jack nodded, making notes in his notebook. Lisa continued. Your friends confirmed that you did spend the evening with them. But we have some questions about your financial affairs. We've learned that you have significant debts and a life insurance policy on your wife. How do you explain that? Thomas sighed and began to explain that his financial situation was complicated. He mentioned failed investments and unsuccessful business ventures. Speaking about the insurance policy, he added that it was a standard precaution to protect his family. I understand how this might look, he said, but I would never do anything to harm Kelly. We were in a tough situation, but that doesn't mean I'm guilty. Thomas continued to insist on his innocence, but his confidence seemed increasingly forced. His behavior was strange. He frequently stumbled over his words, avoided direct eye contact, and displayed signs of nervousness. After the interrogation, Jack and Lisa discussed the information between themselves. Lisa observed, his story seems too smooth. There's more he's trying to hide. His behavior and financial problems make him a prime suspect. Yes, Jack agreed, we need to dig deeper. His explanations about the policy and debts raise a lot of questions. We should check his financial records and his connections. The next step in the investigation was a thorough examination of Thomas's financial affairs, as well as a search for additional evidence that could either confirm or refute his statements. The police were determined to uncover all the details of this complex case to find the true culprit and understand why this tragedy occurred. The day after Thomas Clayton's interrogation, detectives Jack Rivers and Lisa Holt decided to meet with Thomas's friends, who were with him that night playing poker. They hoped these conversations would clarify the events and possibly reveal new evidence. The detectives headed to a local bar, a popular hangout for the residents of Catone. There, they met with several of Thomas's friends who were at the poker party: Jason Harper, Alex Martin, and David Wilson. All three looked concerned but tried to remain composed. Thank you for coming, Jack began once everyone was seated at the table. We want to discuss how the evening went and what you remember about Thomas's behavior. Jason, a middle-aged man with a thick beard, started. We were playing poker, drinking some beer, and reminiscing about old times. Thomas was in a good mood, as usual. We played late into the night. Honestly, he didn't act strange at all. Alex, a lean young man with a slight stubble, added. I remember he checked the time around 11:30. We all thought it was time for him to head home. He said goodbye and left. David, who sat a bit apart from the others, chimed in. We kept playing until midnight. After that, we all went home. I can't say exactly where Thomas was at that time, but I did see his car parked near the bar when I left. Jack and Lisa listened intently, noting down every word. The friends' testimonies confirmed that Thomas was with them for most of the evening, but it didn't rule out the possibility that he could have left earlier or returned home later than he claimed. Lisa decided to ask deeper questions. Did you notice anything unusual about Thomas's behavior? Or anything that might suggest he was involved in any dispute with Kelly? The three men exchanged glances, but no one could recall anything noteworthy. Jason, trying to remember the details, added, maybe he seemed a bit tense, but that was related to his financial problems. We talked about it, and he said he was worried about his debts. Alex nodded. Yeah, he mentioned how hard it was dealing with money. But none of us thought it would lead to something like this. He always seemed sincere and concerned. David, recalling another detail, added, yeah, I remember him talking about some financial difficulties, but he never mentioned violence or anything like that. This all seems strange. Jack and Lisa thanked Thomas's friends for their time and promised to keep them informed. After they left, the detectives discussed the information among themselves. The friends' statements confirmed that Thomas was indeed with them. Jack said, "But that doesn't rule out the possibility that he could have gone home earlier or that his emotional state might have influenced his actions." "Yes, and his financial troubles appear to be a possible motive," Lisa added. "But we need more information." The investigation continued, and the detectives knew that every detail could be crucial to solving the case. Each new step brought them closer to the truth, and they were determined to uncover it to ensure justice was served. After analyzing the testimonies of Thomas's friends and information about his financial situation, Jack and Lisa decided to revisit the key pieces of evidence, those that might point to Thomas's involvement. They returned to the Clayton house for another inspection. One aspect that caught the detectives' attention was the oddity in Thomas's behavior. His reaction to his wife's death seemed disproportionately calm. Although he claimed to be in shock, his actions after finding the body appeared too controlled and calculated. This included the quick and precise call to 911 and a clear effort to assert his innocence. During the analysis, Lisa noted that Thomas frequently checked his phone during the interrogation and sometimes seemed irritated when asked uncomfortable questions. These small details didn't align with the typical reaction of someone who had truly lost a loved one. "It seems his behavior contradicts a normal reaction to grief," Lisa observed. "He might be trying to hide something more." Jack agreed. His story about finding Kelly seems too straightforward. He talks about the mess, but the details of his account don't fully add up. Based on these observations, the detectives decided to scrutinize Thomas's financial documents more closely. The reports revealed many concerning issues, debts, failed investments, and a sudden need for a large sum of money from Kelly's life insurance policy. In search of additional clues, the detectives examined Thomas's personal messages, which he had exchanged with someone under the name M.B. They found several messages discussing financial matters and planning. These messages, though coded, clearly indicated that someone else was involved in this story. Jack and Lisa realized that their suspicions were beginning to be supported by facts. Despite Thomas having an alibi, his behavior and financial problems laid the groundwork for further investigation. The suspicion of his involvement was becoming more justified, and the detectives began to focus on his possible connection with someone else. "We need to conduct another interrogation of Thomas and get more information about his connection with this mysterious MB, Lisa suggested. Jack nodded. "Yes, and we should check if Thomas has other connections that could confirm or disprove our suspicions. We need to be sure of every step so as not to miss any important details." The investigation continued, and each new discovery brought them closer to uncovering the truth. They were prepared to use all available means to achieve justice for Kelly Clayton. In the office of a financial analyst, Jack and Lisa sat at a table surrounded by piles of documents. The analyst, Daniel Foster, had recently agreed to help with the analysis of Thomas's financial records. "Thank you for agreeing to help us, Daniel," Jack began. "We suspect that Thomas's financial problems might be tied to his motive. What can you tell us about his current situation?" Daniel nodded and began reviewing the documents. "Thomas is indeed facing serious financial difficulties," he said, pointing to the papers. "His debts are substantial, and there are several large failed investments. He also has several credit cards with significant balances." "What about the life insurance policy on his wife?" Lisa asked. "We know he was set to receive a large sum in the event of her death." Daniel checked a few more documents and continued. "Yes, Kelly Clayton had a life insurance policy worth $2 million. Thomas was the sole beneficiary. That's quite a substantial amount, especially considering his current debts." Jack glanced at Lisa, and her expression mirrored his own thoughts. A large sum of money could be a strong motive for murder. "We need to check if there have been any recent changes in his financial dealings or attempts to clear his debts," Lisa suggested. "It's also important to find out if he's been trying to manipulate his financial situation to leverage the insurance policy." Daniel continued analyzing the data and soon presented another important detail. "There are records of frequent financial transfers and cash withdrawals. Some transactions seem particularly suspicious, especially those that occurred just before the murder. I also noticed that he withdrew a large sum of cash a few days before Kelly's death." Jack and Lisa examined the provided data. The discrepancies in the financial records and the large cash transactions were clearly suspicious. This could indicate attempts to cover his tracks or prepare a plan. We need to find out what that cash was used for, Jack said. This might give us a clue about how Thomas could have interacted with another accomplice. Lisa added, yes, and we need to confirm that the money was indeed used for something related to the murder. It's possible that it was used for bribery or other actions that could have facilitated the crime. After Daniel provided all the necessary information, Jack and Lisa began investigating the transactions to determine where the cash had gone. They also continued to explore Thomas's financial connections to see if he was linked to criminal circles or used his money to orchestrate the crime. The next step was to determine how these financial details tied in with the other elements of the case. The investigation continued, and each new fact brought the detectives closer to uncovering the full scope of the crime and the motive behind this horrific murder. In the detective's office, Jack Rivers and Lisa Holt were sifting through the new data collected during the investigation. Daniel Foster, the financial analyst, had just handed them information about the suspicious financial transactions of Thomas Clayton. Now, the detectives' attention turned to the correspondence found on Thomas's phone, which they had recently decrypted. Jack turned on the computer and began reviewing the decrypted messages. Lisa sat beside him, closely watching the process. Let's see what we've got here, Jack said, opening the first file. The messages were between Thomas and a person known as MB. Jack and Lisa hoped that the decrypted correspondence would provide a clearer understanding of the agreements made between them. The first message from MB was sent in early August, about a month before Kelly's murder. MB, Thomas, how are things going? Everything okay with your finances? We need to discuss the remaining issues. Thomas, yes, everything is going according to plan. I'm still waiting for confirmation that everything will be done on time. We need everything ready by next week. The next message was sent a few days later. MB, I have news. Everything will be ready as we agreed. But I need a bit more information. Let me know when you can meet. Thomas, all right, I can meet next Tuesday. Don't forget to bring everything we discussed. Gradually, the correspondence became more specific. MB, don't forget that we agreed on the amount. It must be paid in full by the end of the week. This is important to avoid any issues. Thomas, yes, I remember. It'll be done. As soon as I get the final details, I'll let you know. The final messages contained information that particularly alarmed the detectives. MB, Thomas, I have everything we need. But before I start, I need you to finalize all your matters. If there are any problems, let me know. Thomas, I understand. Everything will be ready. Don't worry, I'll make sure it's all set. After examining the correspondence, Lisa said, these messages clearly indicate that there was a financial agreement between Thomas and MB. It seems they were discussing not only money but also specific actions that needed to be carried out. Yeah, and the last messages suggest that things were in the preparation stage, Jack added. This could indicate that they were planning something specific and that Thomas was actively involved in this plan. These messages were a key that could reveal the true motive behind Kelly Clayton's murder and how Thomas Clayton was connected to the crime. After detectives Jack Rivers and Lisa Holt reviewed the secret correspondence between Thomas Clayton and the mysterious MB, they began to focus on uncovering the identity of this enigmatic figure. Jack and Lisa visited the local police department, where they requested assistance in checking identities with similar initials. They provided the details from the correspondence and asked the officers to search for possible matches. Soon, they got the results they needed. We found a few matches, an officer reported, scanning through the documents. Michael Bird, a small-time criminal with a record, shows up in our database. He has ties to organized crime and has been previously arrested for several minor offenses. Jack and Lisa began to examine the information about Michael Bird. They discovered that he was known for his connections to the criminal underworld and often acted as a middleman in illegal deals. This confirmed their suspicions that Michael might have been involved in Thomas Clayton's plans. We need to find out exactly how Michael Bird is connected to Thomas, Jack said, reviewing the documents. There might be more evidence that can confirm their interaction. The next step was to locate Michael Bird and question him. Jack and Lisa headed to the area where Michael was registered to conduct an interview with him. When the detectives arrived at the listed address, they found that Michael Bird lived in a small but well-kept house on the outskirts of town. He opened the door, looking surprised but not scared. He greeted Jack and Lisa with a cautious expression. "Michael Bird?" Jack began, introducing himself. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about your interactions with Thomas Clayton." Though Michael appeared calm, he clearly felt uneasy. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, trying to sound convincing. Lisa, observing his reaction, asked, "We found correspondence between you and Thomas Clayton. It discusses financial matters and other details. Can you explain what this means?" Michael began to show signs of tension. He was silent for a long time before sighing, realizing there was no point in hiding the truth any longer. "All right," he finally said. "I admit I had dealings with Thomas. But it's not related to the murder. We discussed money, but it was about other business we were involved in." Jack and Lisa listened intently. "We know you have criminal connections," Jack continued. "Your correspondence indicates that you were aware of Thomas's financial troubles and might have been involved in planning his actions. We need to know exactly what you discussed and what your plan was." Michael began to explain how he had indeed worked with Thomas but insisted that their dealings were strictly financial and had nothing to do with the murder. He explained that Thomas had asked for his help with some matters related to his business and finances, but there was no mention of any violent actions. "We met a few times, discussed money and plans, but I had no idea it could be connected to a murder," Michael said, growing increasingly anxious. Jack and Lisa continued to press for more information, trying to determine whether Michael had additional knowledge about Thomas's plans or other possible accomplices. In the end, Michael revealed that the last time he saw Thomas was a few days before the murder. And they had discussed finalizing a deal involving the cash Thomas was supposed to provide. "I've already finished my business with Thomas and had no further contact with him," Michael assured. "If I had known he was planning something like this, I would never have gotten involved." Jack and Lisa realized that Michael was likely not the only player in this scheme, and they needed to continue their investigation to determine whether his role was truly limited to financial dealings or if he was involved in more complex criminal plans. The day after questioning Michael Bird, detectives Jack Rivers and Lisa Holt received information about a potential witness who could provide key testimony in their case. Jennifer Holmes, a resident of Seton, had recently contacted the local police department, reporting that she had seen an unfamiliar man near the Clayton residence on the night of the murder. The detectives set out to meet Jennifer and take her statement. They arrived at her home, which was located in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. Jennifer greeted them at the door, her face showing signs of anxiety and unease. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with us, Jennifer," Jack said as they entered the house. "Can you tell us exactly what you saw that night?" They settled into a cozy living room, and Jennifer began recounting her story. "I often stay up late and like to look out the window," she started, clearly nervous. "That night, I noticed someone standing near the Clayton house. At first, I didn't pay much attention. But when I saw that this person remained there for a long time, I began to feel uneasy." "Can you describe this person?" Lisa asked, turning on a recorder to capture the testimony. Jennifer thought for a moment and continued. "He was tall, about 6 feet, and dressed in dark clothing. I couldn't see his face because he was in the shadows. But what struck me was that he kept looking at his watch and seemed very tense." Jack exchanged glances with Lisa. This information was crucial, but they needed more details. "Did you see this person leave?" Jack asked. "Or notice anything else that might help us identify him?" Jennifer nodded. "Yes, I saw him leave. He headed towards the park that's near the house. I tried to remember which way he went and noticed that he was moving quickly, like he was in a hurry." Lisa jotted down the information and then asked a few more questions to clarify the details. "Are there any other characteristics you recall that could help us identify this person?" she asked. Jennifer pondered for a moment before adding, "I remember he was talking on the phone. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but his voice was low and calm. It was strange because he looked like something was really bothering him." Jack and Lisa thanked Jennifer for her testimony. They understood that this witness account could be the key to uncovering who was near the Clayton house on the night of the murder. Now, they needed to match the description of this man with the information they already had. "We'll use this information to check the surveillance cameras in the park where he was headed," Jack said. "There might be footage that can help us identify him." Lisa added, "We should also check if there are other witnesses in the area who might have seen this person. And, of course, we need to compare his description with those connected to Thomas Clayton." Jack and Lisa returned to their office, where they began processing the information they had obtained from Jennifer. They requested surveillance footage from the park area and started reviewing it in hopes of finding additional evidence. The process was time-consuming, but soon they came across footage showing a man matching Jennifer's description. He was indeed in the area near the Clayton house on the night of the murder, moving in the direction she had described. "It looks like our suspicions are being confirmed," Jack said, examining the footage. "Now we need to find out who this man is and how he's connected to the case." Lisa nodded in agreement. The next step was to identify the man in the footage and determine how he was linked to the murder of Kelly Clayton. After receiving new testimony from Jennifer Holmes and reviewing the surveillance footage, detectives Jack Rivers and Lisa Holt decided to intensify their investigation. They believed that Thomas Clayton's phone might contain more evidence that could expose his role in the crime. Jack and Lisa requested a court order to tap Thomas's phone. The order was granted, and technical specialists began setting up the wiretap on Thomas's mobile device. "We need to understand who Thomas is communicating with and what they're discussing after his wife's death," Jack said. "We already know his correspondence with Michael Bird was suspicious. It's possible he's continuing to discuss his actions or details of the plan over the phone." For the first few days, the wiretap didn't yield significant results. Thomas's conversations were mostly mundane: talks with friends, attempts to find ways to cope after Kelly's death, and interactions with various services related to her funeral and estate. However, the detectives soon began noticing some suspicious calls and messages. One day, while reviewing the recordings, Lisa noticed a few strange conversations. "Jack, take a look at this," Lisa said, showing the computer screen. "This conversation happened today. Thomas is discussing some kind of job, and it sounds like he's talking about finishing something up." Jack carefully examined the recording. Thomas was speaking with an unknown person, and the conversation seemed tense. "Thomas, we've already discussed everything. As I understand it, everything should be completed within the week." "Right? Unknown. Yes, it will be done as we agreed. But I need to clarify some details. When can you meet?" "Thomas, I'll try to free up some time tomorrow. We can meet at my house. Just remember, this needs to be finished quickly." "Unknown. All right, I'll bring everything we need. Make sure everything is ready." Jack and Lisa concluded that this conversation was significant. It indicated that Thomas was continuing to interact with some accomplice or intermediary, discussing details that could be related to his crime. "We need to find out who this unknown person is," Jack said. "We have to investigate who else was involved in this case and how they're connected to Thomas." Lisa nodded and suggested, "We can use this information to conduct further investigations and question people who might be involved. We also need to find the specific location where Thomas plans to meet and check it out." The detectives continued to monitor Thomas's phone calls and messages, trying to uncover all connections and details. Each new conversation and message helped them piece together how Thomas was interacting with others and how he was attempting to cover his tracks. Soon, they came across another crucial conversation that might provide an answer to who was the final link in this crime. "Thomas, can you update me on how things are going with this matter? I have serious doubts, Bird." "Unknown, don't worry. Everything is under control. We're finishing up the last details, and everything will be ready on time." Jack and Lisa continued to analyze the recordings, cross-referencing them with other evidence. They knew that every new piece of information could be decisive in uncovering the truth and ensuring justice for Kelly Clayton. The information gathered from the correspondence and phone conversations was sufficient to press charges and detain Michael Bird. Jack and Lisa conducted the operation to arrest Michael Bird at his home, which was in the same neighborhood where they had previously interrogated him. The operation was carefully planned to minimize risk and ensure that Michael would not have the opportunity to flee or destroy evidence. When the detectives arrived at Michael's house, they were ready for the arrest. Lisa and several accompanying officers knocked on the door, and after a brief wait, Michael opened it. "Michael Bird?" Jack began, showing his badge. "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of involvement in a contract murder." Michael appeared shocked and bewildered. His hands trembled as he tried to comprehend what was happening. "What? How is this possible?" Michael stammered, his voice sounding frightened. Lisa and several other officers entered the house and began searching for potential evidence. Soon, Michael was handcuffed and informed of his rights. "Michael, you have the right to remain silent," Lisa said, reading him his rights. Anything you say can be used against you in court. Michael was taken to the police station, where he was placed in an interrogation room and the detectives began preparing for the interview. During the interrogation, Michael tried to maintain his composure, but the stress of the arrest and the mounting evidence began to weigh on him. "Michael, we have enough evidence linking you to Kelly Clayton's murder," Jack began. "Your correspondence, the intercepted calls, and the witness testimonies all point to your involvement." Michael looked defeated and somewhat lost. "I'm not guilty," he started, trying to defend himself. "I was just doing my job. I didn't know it was connected to a murder. Thomas Clayton never mentioned anything like that." Lisa, sitting across from Michael, tried to be firm. "We know you discussed financial matters with Thomas and that you had plans involving large sums of money. These plans are clearly related to Kelly's murder. We need to understand how you were connected to this crime and who else might be involved." Michael began nervously fidgeting with his hands, his face paling. "All right," he said finally. "I admit I was involved in a deal with Thomas. But I didn't know it would lead to this. I can tell you what happened, but you need to understand that I'm telling the truth." Jack and Lisa listened carefully to his confession, recording every word. Michael started revealing details about his connection with Thomas and explained that he had merely acted as a mediator in the transactions, not knowing about Thomas's plans related to the murder. "We discussed that Thomas was supposed to pay for some work," Michael continued. "But he never mentioned it was connected to a murder. I thought it was just some business deal." Jack and Lisa recorded all the details of the confession and asked Michael additional questions to ensure they had a complete picture of his involvement in the crime. Ultimately, Michael agreed to cooperate with the authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. "If you provide full testimony, we may consider a deal," Lisa offered. "Your testimony could help solve this case and establish the entire picture." Michael agreed to cooperate and provided detailed information about his interactions with Thomas Clayton. His testimony became key to uncovering further details of the crime and confirming Thomas's role in the contract murder. After the interrogation, Michael Bird was transferred to a detention center, and his further testimony began to form the basis for final charges against Thomas Clayton. The next step was to use Michael's information to conclude the investigation and prepare for the trial. After Michael Bird's arrest and confession, the investigation took a decisive turn. Thomas Clayton was placed in the local detention center, awaiting trial for the contract murder of his wife, Kelly Clayton. With his case becoming a topic of public discussion, he found himself under close scrutiny from both investigators and fellow inmates. The cell where he was placed was small and had 2 bunks. At first, he was alone, but soon he was joined by another inmate named Jacob Wright, who was already known for his criminal tendencies. "Thomas, do you know why I'm here? I didn't commit this crime." "Jacob, everyone says that when they get here. But I've heard about you, and it's not a simple case. A lot of people here think you're really involved in that murder." Thomas felt the situation growing increasingly tense. The other inmates were hostile towards him, and rumors about his alleged crime only worsened the situation. During the first few days, Thomas tried to avoid conflicts and kept to himself. However, tension built up, and one night, when the inmates gathered in the cell, a confrontation erupted. "Jacob, you think you can just sit here and do nothing? Everyone hates you for what you've done. Do you understand that your actions led to someone's death?" "Thomas, I'm innocent. It's all a lie. I need to get out of here and prove my innocence." Jacob, seeing that Thomas was beginning to lose his composure, took a few threatening steps toward him. Other inmates also began to gather around, watching the unfolding situation. "Jacob, you know what I'll tell you. Nobody here expected you to walk around like you're lucky. Everyone knows you could be guilty. And some might even try to prove it." The conflict quickly escalated. Jacob began to physically threaten Thomas, and other inmates, fueled by Jacob's actions, started to increase the pressure. The situation in the cell became increasingly volatile, and the guards were forced to intervene to prevent violence. "Guard, step back, calm down. We won't tolerate any disturbances here." The guards separated Thomas and Jacob, and Thomas was temporarily moved to a solitary cell for his safety. This incident only heightened his stress and isolation. Thomas felt that his situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Rumors about his crime had spread among the inmates, and they were against him. It took several days before Thomas could return from solitary confinement and rejoin the general population. His fears and doubts intensified. Inside, he felt that the pressure and isolation might lead him to make a mistake or do something that would only worsen his situation. Meanwhile, detectives Jack Rivers and Lisa Holt continued their investigation, using Michael Bird's testimony and the gathered evidence to strengthen their case. They knew that Thomas's behavior in prison, as well as testimonies from other inmates, could become an important part of the case. They monitored the situation and understood that Thomas needed not only legal justification but also psychological support. This would help him avoid further problems and focus on his defense. The conflict in the jail cell served as an important reminder of how complex circumstances and public opinion can affect a person in custody. For Thomas, it was a test of endurance that could play a crucial role in his fate and in the course of the trial. Jack and Lisa held several working meetings in their office to discuss strategy and assign tasks. Their plan involved a thorough review of all available materials and identifying any missing elements. "Lisa, we already have Michael Bird's confession, but we need to make sure all the details match up. We have to verify every aspect of his testimony and link it to the other evidence." Jack, I agree. Let's start by reviewing all surveillance footage in the area where Michael and Thomas met and gather additional evidence. We also need to recheck the financial transactions related to the case. One of the key elements the detectives examined was Michael Bird's route on the night of the murder. They requested surveillance footage from all major routes that Michael could have used and analyzed it to ensure it matched his account. One such recording was from a camera installed in the park near the Claytons' house, which showed Michael moving in the direction Jennifer Holmes had described. This confirmed his presence in the area and increased confidence in his confession. "Lisa, here are the surveillance records confirming Michael's route. They show that he was indeed in the vicinity of the Claytons' house. Now we need to link this with the financial transactions." Jack checked the bank accounts and transactions related to Thomas Clayton. They discovered significant transfers of funds to Michael Bird's account and other suspicious transactions. This confirmed that the money was exchanged as part of the deal related to Kelly Clayton's murder. Additionally, the detectives conducted a reanalysis of all witness testimonies and case materials. They interviewed additional witnesses, including those who could confirm Michael's presence in the area of the Claytons' house on the night of the murder, and checked if there were other individuals in his circle who could corroborate or refute his claims. "Jack, we've gathered all the necessary evidence. Now we need to prepare the materials for court and ensure we have everything to press charges against Thomas. We also need to be ready for potential defense strategies from his lawyers." Lisa agreed and suggested, "Lisa, I'll work on preparing the final reports and putting together the presentation for court. We need to make sure all the evidence is presented clearly and convincingly." Over the next few days, Jack and Lisa worked on finalizing the evidence package. It included recordings of conversations, video footage, financial documents, and testimonies that confirmed Michael Bird's confession and his connection to Thomas Clayton. Once all the materials were ready, they submitted them to the prosecution. Soon after, a court hearing was scheduled, and Clayton's case became a matter of public interest. The anticipation of the trial created a tense atmosphere in the town of Cadone, where people discussed the proceedings and its implications. With the investigation nearing its end, the detectives knew their work was far from over. They would have to testify in court, present the evidence, and prove Thomas Clayton's guilt. It was a crucial test that would determine the outcome of the case and the fate of the accused. The trial of Thomas Clayton began at noon in a courtroom packed with journalists, local residents, and members of Kelly Clayton's family. The interest in the case was immense, and the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. Every word, every piece of evidence mattered, and everyone involved understood the significance of the upcoming days. Jack Rivers and Lisa Holt represented the prosecution, having prepared a detailed presentation of evidence and witnesses. Thomas Clayton's attorney, David Morgan, was an experienced defender who knew how to handle court proceedings and challenge the accusations. The trial commenced with the opening statements from the prosecution. Prosecutor Marion Brooks took the stand to present the case. Marion Brooks: "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here to consider the charges against Thomas Clayton for orchestrating the murder of his wife, Kelly Clayton. We will present evidence showing that the defendant used Michael Bird to carry out his criminal plan. We will demonstrate how financial transactions, correspondence, and testimonies link him to the crime. Marion started by showing surveillance footage confirming Michael Bird's presence in the area of the Claytons' home on the night of the murder. She then presented financial documents revealing money transfers from Thomas to Michael, as well as messages from Thomas's phone discussing the completion of work. The next step was the testimony of Michael Bird. He took the witness stand and confirmed his statements, explaining his involvement in the deal with Thomas and how it eventually led to Kelly's murder. His confessions, supported by additional evidence, left no doubt about his participation in the crime. David Morgan: Michael, you claimed that Thomas Clayton offered you money for some job. Can you clarify what you thought when you accepted this offer? Michael Bird: I thought it was related to some business, nothing more. I wasn't told it involved murder. David tried to cast doubt on Michael's testimony, but the prosecution had strong counter-arguments. They provided evidence showing that Michael knew more than he admitted and that his testimony was corroborated by other evidence. Detectives Jack Rivers and Lisa Holt then took the stand. They detailed the investigation, the intercepted conversations, how they tracked Michael's route, and gathered evidence confirming Thomas's guilt. Lisa Holt: we conducted an extensive investigation to verify all the evidence. We ensured that the financial transactions, witness testimonies, and recorded conversations all confirm that Thomas Clayton indeed orchestrated the murder of his wife. During the trial, the defense attorney attempted to present alternative versions of events, arguing that the evidence was open to interpretation and that not all facts had been considered. He also tried to refer to Thomas's emotional state, his mental health issues, and their impact on his behavior. However, the prosecutors, relying on precise evidence and testimonies, successfully countered these arguments. They emphasized that Thomas's motive, means, and actions were clearly and consistently established and that he had attempted to cover his tracks and manipulate others to achieve his goals. As the trial neared its conclusion, the jury retired to deliberate. The prosecution and defense gave their closing statements. Summarizing the entire proceedings, Prosecutor Marion Brooks concluded the case by reminding the jury of how the evidence linked Thomas to the crime. Marion Brooks: Your Honor, we have more than enough evidence to establish the defendant's guilt. Thomas Clayton, using financial resources and connecting with Michael Bird, orchestrated the murder of his wife. We ask you to find him guilty as charged. Defense attorney David Morgan, in his closing statement, attempted once more to highlight doubts. But the jury was already well informed about the evidence. After a tense trial, marked by the significant efforts of detectives, prosecutors, and defense attorneys, the moment of truth arrived. The court delivered its verdict in the case of Thomas Clayton. The courtroom was crowded. Local residents, journalists, and Kelly Clayton's family had gathered to hear the outcome of the trial. The judge, an elderly man with a stern expression of focus, entered the courtroom and took his place behind the bench. He looked intently at the defendant and the jury before beginning to read the verdict. Judge, members of the jury, you have reached a verdict in the case of Thomas Clayton. I ask you to announce the results. The jury foreman stood and stepped forward. Foreman: Your Honor, after careful consideration of all the evidence and testimonies, we have reached a unanimous conclusion. We find the defendant, Thomas Clayton, guilty of orchestrating the murder of his wife, Kelly Clayton. Thomas Clayton, sitting in the courtroom, appeared despondent. His face was pale, and he avoided making eye contact with those around him. His attorney, David Morgan, was deeply engrossed in his notes, searching for any possible errors or grounds for an appeal. Judge, Thomas Clayton, in light of your conviction for this serious crime, the court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Your actions have led to a tragedy that has shocked many, and this sentence reflects the severity of your crime. The judge's words were like a thunderclap for Clayton, and his reaction was immediate. Quiet sighs and whispers filled the courtroom. Kelly Clayton's family, sitting in the front row, expressed a mixture of relief and sorrow. They found some comfort in the fact that justice had been served, but the bitterness of their loss was still fresh. Lisa Holt and Jack Rivers observed the proceedings, their faces a blend of satisfaction from their work and sadness for what had transpired. They knew their efforts could not bring Kelly back, but justice had been restored. After the sentencing and the conclusion of the court session, Thomas Clayton was taken to prison. He faced years of incarceration, where he would have to deal with the consequences of his actions. The town of Katon began to return to normalcy. Although Kelly's murder and the trial of her husband had left a deep mark on the residents' minds, they tried to move forward. The morning after the verdict, the local newspaper published an article summarizing the case. And photos of Kelly and her family appeared on the front pages once again. Jack Rivers, we did everything we could. Now they can start healing their wounds and moving on. The important thing is that justice has prevailed. Lisa Holt, yes. And while we cannot bring Kelly back, we can hope that this case shows others that justice works and that even the most severe crimes do not go unpunished. The chapter on the trial concluded, but time would show how Ketone, with its small victories and losses, would move forward, and how Kelly Clayton's family would learn to live in new conditions after the tragedy that had shaken their world. After the verdict that closed the case against Thomas Clayton, life in the town of Ketone began to gradually return to normal. Speaking of the time after the trial, this phase became a symbol of how society and individuals start to cope with losses and move on. Thomas Clayton spends his days waiting to begin his life sentence. His cell is a small, dimly lit space with a single bunk and a table. This corner is devoid of any comfort or luxury, marked by its starkness. Thomas sits on the bunk, holding a photograph of his wife. It's an old black and white photo capturing Kelly in a moment of joy, her bright smile against the backdrop of a sunny day. The photograph is one of the few items he managed to keep when he moved to prison. He runs his finger along the edges of the photo, his eyes filled with deep sorrow. Thomas remembers the happy moments they shared and the pain of loss caused by his own actions. Inside, he is overwhelmed by emotions ranging from regret to profound self-destruction. He knows he cannot return to his old life and that his actions have forever altered his fate. The light in the cell is dim, and the surrounding silence only emphasizes his solitude. Outside, where the world continues to turn and the town of Ketone recovers from the tragedy, Thomas remains trapped in his inner world. The cell contains few belongings, a blanket he uses for warmth and a few books provided by the prison library. On the table lie legal documents and scraps of newspaper articles recounting his story. These papers, once perhaps significant, now serve only as reminders of what he has lost. Thomas places the photograph on the table and turns to sit on the bunk. He stares at a fixed point, his face a blend of acceptance and deep regret. The barred window allows a sliver of sunlight to filter in, casting long stripes on the walls. This light symbolizes a glimmer of hope that, perhaps over time, he might find some internal reconciliation. Even if he can never reclaim what he has lost. Thomas Clayton, how everything has changed. I never thought my life would turn out this way. As autumn continued in Ketone, life was gradually returning to its usual course, but the memories of the tragedy and the trial continued to leave a deep mark on the town and its residents. The once peaceful and serene town now felt the weight of loss, yet also carried a hope for recovery. Kelly Clayton's family, despite their pain, tried to find strength to move forward. Kelly's father, James Harper, became an activist in the local community, working to establish a fund in his daughter's memory. This fund aimed to assist victims of domestic violence and support crime prevention programs. James Harper, we can't change what happened, but we can try to make the world a better place to prevent such tragedies in the future. Kelly deserves to have her memory live on through acts of kindness and helping others. Kelly's mother, Elizabeth Harper, dedicated her life to volunteering with local charities. She found solace in helping those who had also faced difficult times, and her work became a symbol of resilience and hope for many. The Clayton family remained in the background, and although Thomas was convicted, his name continued to be a topic of conversation. The town was divided in its perception. Some residents still discussed the details of the case, while others, striving to move forward, focused on restoring peace in their lives. Mayor of Ketone, this case shook our town, but we must remember that we are strong. We can get through this by supporting each other and working for the betterment of our community. The local newspaper, which had extensively covered the trial and its aftermath, also reported on the positive changes in the town's life. It regularly published articles about how the community was coming together to support one another and rebuild lost trust. In the months following the trial, various public events were held in Ketone in honor of Kelly and in support of her family. The story of Kelly Clayton and her tragic loss left a deep imprint on Ketone. But her memory continued to live in the hearts of those who knew her and in the actions of those striving to make the world a better place in her honor. The town of Katone, with its changes and new beginnings, taught its residents the importance of maintaining humanity and resilience even in the toughest times.